A black waitress stands still, her hands trembling, water dripping from the tray now shattered at her feet. A white man in a navy blazer has just slapped her, open palm, across the face, in front of a room full of wealthy lunch patrons. No one moves. No one speaks. Forks pause mid-air. The manager, red-faced and flustered, doesn't confront the man. Instead, he turns to her and says, "Go in the back." She nods without a word, cheeks burning with more than pain. The man sits back down, chuckling, sipping his wine like nothing happened. Around him, men in tailored suits lean in and whisper. The room exhales, ready to return to its steak tartare and Chardonnay. But before she disappears into the kitchen, the front door swings open. A tall black man steps inside, dressed in a crisp gray suit, eyes scanning the room like he already knows. No one knows who he is. Not yet. But they will. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Comment below. The restaurant sat on the corner of a wealthy Georgia suburb, nestled between designer boutiques and art galleries. Its white columns and brass accents made it look like an old courthouse turned fine dining. The kind of place where people wore cardigans over their shoulders and greeted the hostess by name. Lunch was a slow, curated ritual. The guests came for the Cobb salad, but stayed for the sense of being catered to. In the back, behind the hush, of cloth napkins and soft jazz, she moved like water. The black waitress, always in pressed black slacks and a spotless apron, never raised her voice. Her steps were measured, her hands sure. 5 years she'd worked there, never late, never loud. She carried herself like she didn't belong to the noise around her, like she had somewhere better to be, but chose this room anyway. The regulars called her sweetheart or girl, never her name. They asked for extra napkins without looking up. Some left no tips. Others touched her arm as they ordered, as if politeness cost them something. She never flinched, never pulled away. Her dignity was stitched into her silence. In the kitchen, the younger waiters said she was too calm, too quiet, but they also leaned on her during the rush. When orders stacked up and tempers flared, she was the one they trusted to fix it. She didn't complain, didn't gossip, just did the job. She was the kind of person people overlooked and depended on at the same time. Still, she knew the lines drawn around her. The chef could shout. The hostess could cry in front of customers. But if she ever raised her voice, if she ever let frustration show, it would be her last shift. The unspoken rule was clear. She had to be perfect, invisible, and grateful all at once. That morning had been like any other. She'd arrived early, helped the dishwasher unload crates of vegetables, brewed the coffee, and tied her apron while the dining room lights clicked on. The first few tables trickled in around 11. Retired couples, a local councilman, 2 realtors talking about zoning permits. Then the door opened and 4 white men walked in, loud, laughing, their presence louder than the saxophone playing overhead. They wore expensive watches and drank hard liquor before noon. The hostess smiled, do-eyed, and rushed them to the corner booth, the one reserved for important guests. She was assigned their table. She didn't sigh, didn't blink. She just picked up the notepad and walked forward. They were already on their second round of bourbon by the time she reached their table. The man seated at the center, older than the rest, ruddy complexion, sharp jaw, a voice that boomed even when he whispered, barely glanced at her as she greeted them. His gold cufflinks shimmered against his navy blue blazer. The others deferred to him without question. He was clearly the alpha, the one who paid the bill and signed the deals. She moved efficiently, notebook in hand, repeating their orders back with quiet precision. One of the younger men, barely out of college, smirked and leaned closer than he needed to. "You sure you can handle all that, sweetheart?" he muttered as she stepped away. The older man chuckled. She didn't respond, just walked toward the kitchen, her pace steady, her back straight. 10 minutes later, she returned with appetizers. One hand balanced the tray, the other served with delicate speed. But as she reached across the table to place a plate of seared scallops, the older man leaned back suddenly, on purpose. Her wrist brushed his shoulder. It was a small thing, a human accident. He exaggerated the contact, drawing attention to it with a bark of laughter. "Easy now," he said loudly. "Didn't know this place offered full service." A few heads turned. Someone near the window laughed. She straightened without expression, murmured a soft apology, and stepped back. The manager had seen it. From behind the host stand, he watched it all. Still, he didn't approach the table. Instead, he waved her over with a quick snap of his fingers. "You need to be more careful," he said under his breath, jaw tight. "These men are important." She said nothing, just nodded and returned to the kitchen. By the time the entrees were ready, the table had grown louder. The older man's voice cut through the dining room like a saw, talking about lazy contractors and entitled tenants. He made jokes about affirmative action, about woke audits, about how everything these days was too sensitive. His friends laughed in chorus, their laughter bouncing off the marble walls. She returned to their table. She placed the plates, with the same grace she always used. But as she bent slightly to refill his glass, the man reached up and touched her waist. Just for a second. Just enough. She stepped back, not quickly, not dramatically. Just enough to move out of his reach. He stared at her. Something flickered in his eyes. Anger, entitlement, a challenge. Then, without warning, he stood. His hand rose, and before anyone could move, the sound cracked across the room. Sharp, sudden, cruel. His palm met her cheek. The tray hit the floor. Plates shattered. Her body didn't fall, but something inside her did. The room fell silent. A fork clinked against porcelain in the distance. Then nothing. She didn't cry. Didn't speak. Her cheek burned red. Her eyes blinked slow. She looked at him once. Not with rage, not with fear. Just a long, quiet stare like she was memorizing him. The manager rushed over, but not to her. He placed a hand on the man's shoulder and whispered something meant to calm. Then he turned to her. "Go in the back," he said. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. She just knelt to pick up the tray. Her fingers shook slightly as she gathered. Shards of broken ceramic wet with wine and water. Around her, people began moving again, but slower, uneasy. A woman with gray hair put down her fork. A couple near the window whispered behind their napkins. A young server stood frozen near the bar, tears in her eyes. The man sat back down, picked up his glass, took a long sip. No one asked him to leave. No one offered her help. She turned, tray in hand, and walked toward the kitchen, and no one, not a single person, said a word to stop her. The hallway to the kitchen stretched longer than usual. Her steps were slow, not weak but careful. Each movement felt like it might echo. Her cheek throbbed with warmth, but she didn't raise her hand to touch it. She kept her fingers wrapped around the broken tray, gripping it like it was the only thing still holding form. She passed the bar where the younger server stood stiff, eyes red. The girl opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. Her gaze dropped. Another silence added to the pile. In the kitchen, the noise of clanging pans and shouting orders died the moment she stepped through the swinging door. The cook paused mid-sentence. The dishwasher stopped spraying. They looked at her, at the side of her face, at her trembling fingers. She didn't explain. She didn't need to. She walked to the nearest sink, set the tray down, and began to wash. Her hands, not because they were dirty, but because it gave her something to do. The water ran for a long time. No one came after her. No manager, no apology, no justice. Just water running down the drain, circling the pieces of who she had to be to survive here. Always calm, always composed, always a shadow with a smile. She took off her apron slowly, folding it into a neat square and placed it gently on the counter. Her locker was nearby, but she didn't reach for it. She didn't need her things. Not now. She walked to the back door, past the dry storage, past the calendar with her name written in permanent ink on every weekday shift. She paused only once, to look out the small window in the steel door. The alley was empty. Just sunlight. and brick a quiet stillness waiting for her. She pushed the door open. No one stopped her. The sound of the restaurant faded as it closed behind her, replaced by the rustle of trees and the steady hum of distant traffic. The outside air was cool, almost tender. She stood still for a moment. Not crying, not trembling, just breathing. Then, she walked around the building, past the parking lot, past the patio where couples sipped coffee and said nothing, around to the front, and there she stood, across the street, across the hedge-lined walkway, watching the building that had held her for 5 years, watching the doorway she'd entered 1,000 times, each time smaller than the last. She stood with her back straight, hands still, like a statue, like a storm that had decided not to break. She did not know exactly why she waited, but she waited. And within minutes, a car pulled up, sleek, quiet, familiar. The driver's door opened, and from it stepped the only man who had ever looked at her and seen more than what she carried, more than how she served, more than how she kept the pain tucked so far inside. No one ever heard it. He looked at her face. He didn't speak. He just nodded once. Then he walked inside. The bell above the restaurant door gave a soft chime as he stepped inside, but no one seemed to notice at first. He didn't belong to the rhythm of the room. His presence was quiet, still, but undeniable, like the air shifted around him. Dressed in a sharp gray suit, no tie, wedding band shining under the soft chandelier light, he moved through the dining room without looking around. His gaze locked onto the manager, who stood stiff behind the host stand. The manager blinked, confused, then stepped forward with a customer service smile already forming. But it faltered when the man pulled out a small leather badge holder from his coat pocket and flipped it open, just long enough for the gold emblem to catch the light. Assistant District Attorney, Fulton County. There was no announcement, no dramatic gasp, just a slow, collective silence creeping in like a shadow. The chatter dimmed. Forks paused mid-air. Someone set down their wine glass a little too carefully. The ADA leaned in close, his voice barely more than a whisper. My wife was assaulted. In this restaurant. Where is the man who laid hands on her? The manager stammered. His eyes darted toward the booth in the back where the older man still sat, mid-laugh, mid-bite, unaware. He's right over there, sir. She didn't tell us anything. But the ADA was already walking. He passed the tables slowly, and now people watched. They didn't know who he was, not entirely, but they knew enough. They knew power when it moved without raising its voice. He stopped at the table. The older man looked up, smirking with the confidence of someone who had spent his whole life untouched. Can I help you? The ADA didn't answer. He turned to the entrance. 2 uniformed officers were already stepping through the door. The shift in the room was immediate. Chairs pushed back. People whispered. Phones rose from handbags. The older man laughed once, dry and sharp, before realizing no one else was laughing with him. This is ridiculous, he said. She bumped into me. It was nothing. Don't be dramatic. You're being placed under arrest for assault, one of the officers said calmly. What? On whose word? The ADA stepped forward. Mine. The handcuffs clicked around his wrists before he could stand. The manager opened his mouth, but said nothing. There was nothing to say. As the man was led out of the restaurant, silence trailed. Behind him, heads turned, eyes followed. The clink of ice in a glass broke the stillness like thunder. The ADA didn't stay to explain. He walked out the way he came in. Outside, his wife stood exactly where he'd left her, calm, still, unreadable. He joined her on the sidewalk. They didn't speak, but their silence said everything. And inside the restaurant, the room would not return to normal, not for a long time. Have you ever watched someone keep their dignity in the face of cruelty? What did it teach you? Share your thoughts in the comments. We're listening. The man who slapped her was silent now. Handcuffed in the back of a squad car, he sat without his blazer, his face drained of its earlier smugness. His friends, once rowdy and full of laughter, remained behind in the booth, whispering among themselves, eyes darting toward the door every time it opened. None of them followed him out. None of them stood up. They just stayed seated, stunned. As the image of power they'd built around themselves began to crack, the restaurant staff stood in small clusters. The younger servers kept stealing glances toward the kitchen door, hoping she'd come back through it. But she didn't. Her shift, her silence, her patience had walked out with her. And suddenly, the space she used to occupy felt larger than they realized. The manager stood motionless behind the counter. He had not spoken since the arrest. He had no words, no plan. His hands fiddled with the reservation book even though no one was making reservations. Not anymore. By the end of the day, the first post hit social media. A short video, blurry, shaky, taken from across the dining room, captured the moment the ADA placed his badge on the table and called for the man's arrest. The sound was muffled, but the silence was deafening. It spread like heat. Within hours, the video had over 300,000 views. By morning, it was on the local news. Fulton County ADA arrests man who allegedly assaulted wife at Buckhead restaurant. Waitress assaulted. Management under fire for inaction. Restaurant's response sparks outrage. The restaurant issued a statement. It was the people had seen before. Carefully worded, vague. They condemned all acts of violence. They promised to review internal protocols. They claimed they were cooperating fully with authorities. But the public had already made up its mind. Photos surfaced of the manager shaking hands with city officials, attending country club events. People started asking questions. Who gets to ignore violence? Who gets protected? The district attorney's office confirmed an investigation had begun, both into the assault and the restaurant's handling of the incident. Civil rights groups weighed in. Prominent voices in the community demanded accountability, and then came the walkout. By the end of the week, 5 waiters, 3 black, 2 Latina, left the restaurant. Quietly, without drama. One wrote a letter and taped it to the fridge in the employee break room. We deserve to be safe at work. We deserve to be seen. Customers canceled reservations. The booth where the man had sat remained empty for days. The staff stopped seating. Anyone there without saying why. And the manager, placed on administrative leave. Not fired yet, but gone. A new interim manager was brought in. Someone with a clipboard and a stiff smile who walked the floor like they were stepping around glass. But something else changed, too. People started talking differently. Servers looked each other in the eye more often. The kitchen ran quieter, but not colder. And when a guest raised their voice, they didn't look to the back. They looked to each other. Even patrons who had been there that day came back, not to dine, but to ask for her, to leave letters, to say sorry. Not all of them, not most, but enough because she hadn't yelled. She hadn't demanded anything. She had stood in her silence, and that silence had become a mirror. The community didn't see just her. They saw themselves, their hesitations, their complicity, their quiet agreement with injustice when it was easier to look away. The reckoning had begun, and it wasn't loud. It was steady. The restaurant tried to move on, but the walls remembered. Though the music still played and the tablecloth still gleamed white, something had shifted. Not just the staff or the management, but the spirit of the place. It no longer hummed with the same easy arrogance. There was an edge to the silence now, as if the room itself had learned to listen. The booth where it happened was never filled again. Not by order, but by agreement. Servers passed it without pausing. Guests were never offered it. The space became a quiet memorial, not with flowers or signs, but with absence. The man who struck her lost more than just his freedom that day. After his arrest, the fallout came swiftly. His firm severed ties. His real estate license was suspended pending investigation. Local investors, once close friends, made public statements distancing themselves. He hired a lawyer, made apologies through a press release, and filed for a reduced charge. But the court of public opinion had already closed its case. The trial was quiet and brief. He pled guilty to a lesser count, misdemeanor battery, but it came with a fine, community service, and mandatory racial bias education, more than he ever expected to face, less than she deserved, but still, accountability. And the restaurant? Faced with growing pressure and a boycott that spread across social media, the ownership issued a second statement, this time with names. The manager was officially terminated. The staff underwent a month-long racial sensitivity and de-escalation training facilitated by a civil rights organization, but they went one step further. They created a new staff position, equity officer, someone whose job was to listen, to see, to intervene when silence tries to bury harm. It wasn't a solution, it wasn't justice, but it was a start. At the front of the house, just before the hostess podium, a new plaque was installed. A small brushed bronze rectangle. No picture, no fanfare. It read, "To those who serve with dignity even when the world forgets to see them, we see you now." She never returned to read it. Months passed. She'd taken a new job before the news cycle even moved on. A small non-profit in South Atlanta that helped women prepare for work, job interviews, resume building, customer service training. She taught a weekly class on professionalism. The irony wasn't lost on her. She spoke softly there, not with bitterness, but with calm authority. Her students often asked where she'd worked before. She'd name the restaurant with a shrug and change the subject. She never mentioned the slap, never said the name of the man or the judge or even her husband's title, but they felt it in her voice. They saw it in how she stood, in how she paused before answering, in how she looked each of them in the eye and said, "You're enough," even when they don't treat you like it. They listened, not because she had a loud story to tell, but because she carried it without needing to. And in the city, the restaurant kept serving food. People returned. Not all, but some. But they remembered. Every time someone asked to switch tables. Every time a server held back tears. Every time a black woman walked in and stood a little taller because someone once refused to bow her head. Change didn't shout. It settled like dust, quiet, steady, permanent. The world didn't stop when it happened. It never does. But in the quiet corners, in classrooms and kitchens, in the way people now pause before they speak or reach or judge, it stayed. The moment lived on not through headlines, but in the slow stitching of something better. Something earned. She never asked to become a symbol. She never raised her voice or demanded her name be known. She just stood still when others wanted her broken, and that stillness became louder than any shout. At the non-profit, the young women she teaches come and go. Some are single mothers. Some are fresh out of high school. Some have never been seen as valuable by anyone. But when she walks into the room, they sit up straighter. They listen not because of what she says, but because of what she's survived. She gives them her time, her calm, her truth. And in return, they give her something back, a sense that maybe in the long curve of things, silence can grow roots. Dignity can spread. Across the city, the restaurant still stands. But now people remember what happened there, not because it was dramatic, but because someone finally said, "Enough," without saying a word, and someone else listened. If this story moved you, share it. Pass it along to someone who needs to know that dignity speaks, softly, powerfully, and forever. Let's keep telling these truths until silence becomes impossible.